The year 1492 is of great significance to the Western world because that's when Christopher Columbus sailed the Atlantic Ocean, landing in the New World. We make a pretty big deal about it. Since this date is so significant to us, I thought I'd talk about what was happening in Africa around this time in the late 15th century. We all know that Christopher Columbus was not the first to sail the Atlantic Ocean, and many people now seem to be aware that other people also sailed the Atlantic. But seldom do we explore when Africans did so. It's said that an African king of the Mali Empire named Abubakar Keita II sailed the Atlantic Ocean long before Columbus, a whole century before him to be exact. Now, the success of his trip is a mystery, but the fact that he did this is well documented by Mansa Musa himself. The Arab-Egyptian scholar named Al-Umari, who spoke with Mansa Musa concerning how he ascended the throne, wrote down what the Malayan king told him. According to Al-Umari, this is what Mansa Musa told him. The ruler who preceded me did not believe it was impossible to reach the extremity of the ocean that encircles the earth. He wanted to reach that end and was determined to pursue his plan. So he equipped 200 boats full of men and many others with water, gold, and provisions, sufficient for several years. He ordered the captain not to return until he had reached the other end of the ocean or until he had exhausted the provisions and water. So they set out on their journey. They were absent for a long period, and at last, just one boat returned. When questioned, the captain replied, "O Prince, we navigated for a long period until we saw in the midst of the ocean a great river which flowed massively. My boat was the last one. Others were ahead of me, and they were drowned in the great whirlpool and never came out again. I sailed back to escape this current." But the Sultan would not believe him. He ordered 2,000 boats to be equipped for him and for his men, and 1,000 more for water and provisions. Then he conferred the regency on me for the term of his absence, and departed with his men, never to return or show any sign of life. In this manner, I became the sole ruler of the empire. In fact, Columbus himself was apparently inspired to take his third voyage because of hearing rumors of Africans sailing the Atlantic. According to the abstract of Columbus's log made by Bartolomeu de las Casas, the purpose of Columbus's third voyage was to test both the claims of King John II of Portugal that canoes had been found which set out from the coast of Guinea and sailed to the west with merchandise, as well as the claims of the native inhabitants of the Caribbean island of Hispaniola that from the south and the southeast had come black people whose spears were made of a metal called ganin, from which it was found that of 32 parts, 18 were gold, 6 were silver, and 8 copper. Columbus and the people of the Iberian Peninsula of Portugal and Spain were very familiar with African people. In fact, the only reason that Columbus was able to sail to the Americas in 1492 was because the Spaniards had just taken back Spain from the Moors after 700 plus years of North African subjugation. Columbus was no slouch at all. He knew very well that the Moors had navigation skills as they sailed the sea to come to Spain to begin with. So Columbus took with him a Moor named Pedro Alonso Nino, who was the navigator or pilot of Columbus's first and third journey. Now, with all that context out of the way, what was going on in the rest of Africa around 1492 during the late 15th century? Well, in West Africa, the classical empire of Songhai was just in its first phases. The great founder of the Songhai Empire, Sani Ali, just died in 1492, but during his tenure, he was dismantling the Mali Empire, becoming the greatest conqueror king West Africa had ever seen. Sani was the most powerful warrior king and had more soldiers than any of his predecessors. In his expeditions, he subdued many lands and became feared amongst his enemies. The Tariq el-Fatash, a book written by an African scholar at Timbuktu, had this to say about Sani Ali. Chi Ali was always victorious and destroyed all the countries that he chose. None of his armies in his presence were defeated. Always the conqueror, never defeated. Right under the vast Songhai Empire lie the Empire of Benin. Benin during this time in 1492 was ruled by the great Oba Ozoluwa. During his long period as sovereign, Ozoluwa transformed Benin from a moderately large kingdom into an empire. Hailed as Ozoluwa the Conqueror, oral histories report that he fought more than 200 battles. Even though his reign was marked with some instability, he still managed to expand Benin into an empire, and by 1492, his reign was well seasoned and Benin growing. Oba Azuluwa was the son of the legendary king Oba Awari the Great of Benin, and because of his accomplishments, Oba Azuluwa became a very important Oba in both the history of the Benin Empire and in the folklore and celebrations in the region. In Central Africa, for the Kanem Empire, 1492 was a crucial moment. Years earlier, the Kanembu were defeated by the Bulala, and their capital of Njimi was taken over. In 1484, the ruler of Kanem, Mai Ali Gaji, constructed a new capital in Borno in northern Nigeria called Ngazagarma, and from that base, the Kanembu intermarried with the local population, creating a new ethnic group called the Kanuri. The establishment of a new base for refugees of Kanem was crucial for the revival of the Kanem Empire, and so, in 1492, Mai Ali Gaji was able to rally the troops and begin conquering a lot of territory with the end goal of reconquering their homeland. And in 1497, Mai Ali Gaji had developed his Borno Empire to such an extent that he was able to return to Kanem and retake the ancestral capital of Njimi from the Bulala. This event was no doubt one of the greatest moments in Central African history and the most important event for the survival of the Kanem Empire's legacy. Also in Central Africa, it was the beginning of the end for the Congo Empire. In 1492, Congo was just being introduced to Christianity for the first time by the disingenuous motives of the Portuguese. King Nzinga Nkuwu sent his ambassador Kasuta to Portugal and instructed him to request priests, carpenters, and stonemasons to build a house of prayer. He also sent Congolese nobles and children to learn Portuguese and become Christians. In 1491, King Nzinga Nkuwu of Congo was baptized and officially accepted Christianity. His baptism was well documented, as he's said to have sat on a throne carved of ivory and wood, which was placed on a high platform, and he also wore a tall crown they called Mpu. The primary reason for the conversion of King Nzinga Nkuwu was articulated by Alan Schofield. It was only then the Portuguese learnt the real reason for the quick conversion. The kingdom was on the point of civil war. Several people were rebelling against the central power, and that Mwene Congo was about to help his son, Afonso, put down the revolt. Naturally, he wanted Portuguese aid. One must try to imagine the Portuguese at this moment. There were not many of them by comparison with their black host. They had come to this remote place to proselytize and begin a trading organization, and within a few weeks of their arrival, they were being asked to take part in a war which did not concern them in the least. But the request came from a brother in Christ, and it was not possible to refuse. So a black army marched out on the Central African field of battle under the banner of the cross, accompanied by a number of white mercenaries carrying muskets. It is hardly surprising that they won the day and returned to the capital in triumph. In gratitude, the Mwene Congo settled the Portuguese in one section of the town, not too far from his own palace, and the two races lived in such amity that doors, it is said, were never closed, and there was no need for guards. The coexistence had begun. Even though King Nzinga Nkuwu clearly had other motivations for his conversion, the actions he took to integrate the Portuguese into Congolese society had disastrous effects, especially because his son, a true convert to Christianity, thought of the Portuguese as his Christian brothers, while they certainly did not think of him or the Congolese as such. They sought to control Congo and drain it of its resources. In southern Africa, around 1492, the Shona kingdom of Mwene Mutapa became the premier Shona state in the region. The founder of Mwene Mutapa, Inyatsimba Mutota, had a son named Matope, who extended Mutapa into an empire during this time. King Matope became very wealthy by exploiting copper and ivory from the Middle Zambezi. King Matope's armies overran the kingdom of Manyinka, as well as the coastal kingdoms of Keteve and others, turning Mwene Mutapa into a vast empire. Much later, a Portuguese chronicler named Antonio Baccaro tells us about Mwene Mutapa. The emperor shows great charity to the blind and maimed, for these are called the king's poor, and have land and revenues for their subsistence. And when they wish to pass through the kingdoms, wherever they come, food and drinks are given to them at the public cost as long as they remain there. And when they leave that place to go to another, they are provided with what is necessary for their journey and a guide, and someone to carry their wallet to the next village. In every place where they come, there is the same obligation, under penalty that those who fail therein shall be punished by the king. Moving along to East Africa and Ethiopia, the year 1492 was during the reign of Emperor Eskender. Eskender, a prominent Christian king, sought to make war on the Muslims in Ethiopia. It was during this time that raids and counter-raids between the Ethiopian Christians and Muslim powers intensified. This period was the beginning stages of determining which religion would have dominion over Ethiopia, Christianity or Islam. It was said that Emperor Eskender was of a bold disposition and was an expert horseman and well trained in the use of bow, shield, and spear. And at the same time, he was gracious, compassionate, and merciful. Previously, in 1487, King John II of Portugal, who had always been eager to enter into communication with Prester John, the mythical Christian ally of Africa, sent on a mission to the east the navigators Perdo de Covilham and Alonso de Pavia. In 1491, de Covilham entered Ethiopia and made his way to the court of Eskender, where the king received him with great honor. Eskender made him his confidant and counselor and found him so useful that apparently he wouldn't allow him to leave. According to some authorities, Eskender was murdered in 1492, but his death was hidden by Queen Helena and her advisors for nearly 3 years. Eskender was succeeded by his son Amda Seyon, who was only 7 years old when he ascended the throne. He died before the end of 1494.